Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod, and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello, and welcome to episode 91 of the Monday Night Review. I had a bit of a milestone this weekend where I hit 10,000 followers on TikTok, which seems like an awful lot of people. I've done social media for the past 15 years, I think. I started my YouTube channel 10 years ago. Anyway, over 10 years ago. Feeling old. And although I've had an amazing group of followers, 10,000 on TikTok seems like an awful lot of people. So if you come over from TikTok, hi. Very much older than most people on there. We've also had rather upsetting news that a body has been found in the river where Nicola Bulley was last seen. So it's not looking good for her safety, which we've known for a while, but I feel incredibly awful for her family. It's distressing at any time, but this feels like it's playing out a lot in the public, and a lot of people have an opinion on it, and that's fine, but a lot of people seem to have been sharing this opinion in public, which I just think is a bit crass at the moment, says the woman with a true crime podcast. So today we've got a bit of a biggie, buckle up. It seems like a while since I've had to do a warning at the top of the show, but today's episode is going to be fairly horrendous, so I will try and give you a warning before anything too gritty. This is your general warning. Man we're going to talk about today is awful. He did horrible things. My sources for today are a Guardian article called The Hunt for the Saturday Night Strangler by Kevin Toulis, British Newspaper Archive, loads on there, Wikipedia, Murderpedia, etc. So for today's episode, we are going to Wales. Thank you so much to Catherine for suggesting this one. As you know, I love a listener suggestion, but especially one I don't really know anything about. So this ticked all the boxes. We are in Wales in the 1970s. So I want to set the scene here as best I can. Looking at my statistics, I know there are some people out there not from the UK, and there are probably some people in the UK not that familiar with Wales. So here we go. With a population of around 2.8 million at the time, the Welsh economy was heavily reliant in the 70s on coal mining, steel production and manufacturing. But the country was facing huge economic challenges with high unemployment rates in some area. Swansea was a major industrial city on the south coast of Wales with a history of copper and coal mining, steel production and manufacturing. However, the city was also going through some economic challenges in the 1970s due to the decline of these industries and the global economic recession. Though it had beautiful beaches and green spaces, Swansea Bay was suffering from pollution caused by industrial waste. In February 1973, Ted Heath was re-elected as leader of the Conservative Party, which was in opposition to the ruling Labour Party in Wales. So Wales is part of Great Britain, even though it's its own country. And there were calls for Welsh devolution and greater political autonomy. And the UK was itself facing huge economic challenges in 1973, including high inflation and rising unemployment. Now, the government implemented policies to try and address these issues, such as wage controls and measures to stimulate economic growth. And this included the famous 3-day week, a period of reduced working hours. Now, it came in during a time of energy shortages caused by the OPEC oil embargo. And it was introduced by the government in response to severe electricity shortage that resulted from the industrial action by coal miners. The 3-day week saw commercial users of electricity being restricted to only using electricity 3 consecutive days a week, with various exceptions such as hospitals, essential services and newspapers. The measure was intended to conserve energy and reduce the risk of power cuts, but this reduction in working hours affected many industries and businesses, and many companies had to adjust their schedules and working arrangements. Schools, for example, were closed on Wednesdays to save energy, and people were encouraged to conserve energy in their homes by turning off lights and reducing heating. Sadly, obviously, things touch wood, are not that bad now, but the energy is not, we're not having a good time in the 2023. We're talking about 1973. The 3-day week was lifted in March 1974 after the miners' strike was settled and the country gradually returned to normal working hours. However, the experience of the 3-day week had significant impact on the United Kingdom, and the energy crisis of the early 1970s led to changes in government policies on energy and industrial relations. It wasn't all grim though. In 1973, Sony opened its first big factory in Bridgend. It was the first major Japanese investment in Wales. The M4 motorway running through South Wales had recently been completed, and the Severn Bridge linking Wales and England had been open for several years, so improving transport links between the two countries, creating jobs but also making commuting jobs easier. And as always, music, dancing and nightlife kept the young people of Swansea going through these rather depressing times. And for teenagers growing up in Swansea in the 1970s, there was a variety of activities available: cinemas, theatres and music venues where young people could socialise and enjoy entertainment were plentiful, and the vibrant music scene with several clubs and several music venues was all the rage. The Top Rank was a popular nightclub in the centre of Swansea that played a mix of pop and disco music. The Marquee Club, located on the High Street in Swansea, was known more for rock music. It hosted many famous acts, including David Bowie and Led Zeppelin. The Tower, located in the Maritime Quarter, played a mix of pop, disco and rock music and had a dance floor and a bar. Glam rock was hugely popular in the early 1970s, with acts such as T-Rex, David Bowie and Roxy Music making a big impact. Songs such as Metal Guru, Starman and Virginia Plain would have been playing in the clubs, along with Stevie Wonder's Superstition, Carly Simon's You're So Vain and the Bee Gees' Staying Alive. On Saturday, the 14th of July 1973, 16-year-old clothing factory worker Sandra Newton was on her way home from a night out in Britton Ferry, where she lived. Though her family said she had no steady boyfriend, she was in fact seeing a married man who would later confess to the police that after leaving the club, they'd gone for a quickie in an abandoned van and he then left her to get home. Literally biting my lip there about the gallantry of this situation. Sandra Newton never made it home. Like many other people did at the time, Newton had tried to hitch a ride home, but she had got in the wrong car. So here's the trigger warning. 3 days later, her body was found raped and strangled in a rural location some miles away from where she was last seen. She'd been strangled with the hem of her own skirt and dumped in a ditch near a coal mine in Tonmore. I'm very sorry to everyone Welsh. Her attacker had made little effort to hide her body. It'd been left at an entrance to a culvert, which is a sort of opening tube to a pipe. Obviously, forensics in the 1970s were not anywhere near what we have now, but police were able to see this and suspect that a local man must be responsible. Only someone familiar with that area would know that it was a sensible place to leave the body. What's really intriguing for me throughout this, though, is the blatantness of it. Had he been bothered to put the body further down into the pipe, then the chances of her being found so soon are much slimmer. Although they did use police dogs in this case. But the fact that he couldn't even be bothered to do that sums him up, I think. So yeah, during the initial stages of the hunt for her killer, they did use the police dogs, but this turned up nothing. 2 months later, in the early hours of Sunday, the 16th of September, 1973, Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd, both aged 16, hitched a lift home after a Saturday night at the Top Rank Club. Each of them earned £16 a week working in a factory, and a taxi cost £4. And the theory of safety in numbers probably held, and so they decided to hitch a ride home. Geraldine was in a white mini dress and described as bubbly with a big laugh, and quiet Pauline was just 5 foot tall in knee-high platform boots with green nail varnish and rings on her fingers, and they were best friends. They lived in next-door villages, and they were going back to stay the night at Pauline's. So they went and waited in a bus stop to keep out of the rain. Buses had long stopped running by the time they got out, when the club finished at 1. And a witness, Philip O'Connor, on his way home sees a white car pull over, pick up the girls, and then pull out into the road next to him. He sees the girls chatting with a man who he describes as having bushy hair and a moustache, and Philip O'Connor would be the last person to see the girls alive. So this next bit's pretty grim. The next morning, while out for a stroll in Clandarcy Woods, 5 miles from where they were last seen, 79-year-old Walter Watkins sees what he first thinks is a doll, but it would turn out to be the body of Pauline Floyd. She's lying face down with her head beaten, her platform boots placed next to her, clothes stained with blood, and a 5-foot length of rope still tied around her neck. Watkins calls the police, and they come and start to search the area and find Geraldine Hughes just 100 yards away. She too has a 5-foot length of rope still around her neck. They were fully dressed when they were found, but it would later be discovered that both girls had been raped and then allowed to get redressed. They had soil and dirt on their feet inside their tights. So he'd obviously allowed them to get redressed and then murdered them. Could it be that he murdered them because he was a local man, they were local girls, and they would have been able to identify him, or was this just an escalation of someone who enjoyed killing people? It appeared that one of the girls had attempted to escape from the attacker, probably when she saw what was happening to the other girl, maybe to go and get help, maybe the other girl was beyond help, and made it just yards from the road near to where her father had worked, but had been caught by the attacker and killed. What police found interesting at the time was how this man had managed to control both the girls at the same time. That's not really known. I think maybe, we know that they died from strangulation. Maybe he struck them on the head to sort of subdue them so he could do what he wanted to do, and when one of the girls saw her best friend being strangled, realised that she had to make a run for it, despite the head injury. Initially, the Hughes and Floyd murders were not linked to that of Sandra Newton. The police assembled a task force of 150 officers, which at the time was the biggest murder inquiry in Welsh history, and they spoke to thousands of people. The wood where the 2 girls were found was close to the busy M4, and they were quickly able to establish that a white Austin 1100 was parked at the entrance to the copse between 11:45am and 2:15am on the Sunday morning. So they believed that this is the killer's car, but no one saw the number plate, and it was only when a witness came forward saying that a car matching that description had been seen going like the clappers in Britain Ferry on the night of Newton's murder that police thought there might be some connection between the cases, and the press soon dubbed the murderer the Saturday Night Strangler. Distressingly, on the 18th of September 1973, so days after the bodies had been found, newspapers, including the Aberdeen Evening Express, would report that girls were still queuing outside clubs to hitchhike home, despite knowing that a man described by Detective Chief Superintendent Ray Allen as seriously dangerous and mentally sick was on the loose. There were no computers, so as with the case of the Yorkshire Ripper, the police team set up a complex system of card indexes and put up posters by clubs saying, "Danger, thumbing lifts has led to murder. Don't." Police and police dogs were everywhere. Distrust seeped through the town. The man was local, and everyone was aware it could be anyone they knew. It could be the postman, it could be the man that sold you your milk in the morning. The only clue was the white Austin 1,100 of which there were 11,000 in the area, and each one had to be tracked down and the owner interviewed. And because there's no computers, this all had to be handwritten. The paperwork and the card indexing got out of hand. We've seen this before with crime cases. It just becomes so difficult to cross-reference anything because of the sheer volume. The police then make an appeal to family members who may be shielding someone they love. They ask them to come forward. No one does. In October 1973, a man who I'm not going to name walked into a police station in Reading and confessed to the murder of Sandra Newton. He was a local to Port Talbot. He said he'd been home, he'd been speaking to her in a club that night. He'd taken some LSD tablets and woken up in a hotel room with rope in his hands. And he concluded that he must have strangled her. And so he then went and threw the rope off the bridge. Now, the police were immediately suspicious of this. They knew that Sandra Newton had been strangled with her own clothing. But as the two other murders involved did use rope, they didn't write it off immediately. They went to the scene with him, but it was quickly proven that he had nothing to do with the murder. And in fact, it turns out he had a mental age of about 9. And it would be in April 1975 that he was taken to court and pleaded guilty to making a false report to the police. But during the time, as I've said, with all the paperwork, the time this takes is terrifying because it's all time taken away from tracking the actual murderer. So this is a problem. In 1976, 3 years after the murders and with the killer still unidentified, police renewed their appeal for information and asked that parents pick their teenagers up from dances and, failing that, encouraged them to take taxis home. That Saturday night, the police had 50 officers patrolling the area and picked up 32 men curb crawling who they took in for interview. Worryingly, after midnight, they counted 26 women trying to hitch lifts out of Swansea. I mean, although the good thing to come out of this is that the public who may have thought that the police had given up on these 3 unsolved murders were then made aware that the police were still working on it. Meanwhile, in Downing Street, Jean Hughes, Geraldine's mother, led a protest with 50 of her friends from the sewing factory. She had with her a petition with 9,000 signatures calling to bring back hanging. If they ever catch the person responsible, they should hang him, she said. I want him to feel the rope around his neck like the girls felt. But back in Wales, with nothing to go on and just a mass of paperwork, the hunt was winding down, and soon all of the boxes of statements and much of the girls' clothing was shipped to Sandfields police station in Port Talbot. Over the next 30 years, a lot of it would be lost and destroyed. Loads of it got damp and mouldy. But luckily, the girls' underwear, which was the most valuable source of DNA evidence, was kept safe in a dry storeroom, as was the clothing belonging to Sandra Newton. And as scientific techniques developed, they began to run tests on these clothing. Initially, the DNA had become so jumbled that nothing could be made of it. So when they first tested it, they needed more DNA evidence than they had, a larger amount. Then in 1998, a new low-copy DNA test was developed that needed only a small amount of evidence to build a profile. They could only find a partial profile in the evidence from Geraldine Hughes, but eventually they developed a full DNA profile from the evidence found on the clothing of Pauline Floyd. They ran this through the police system holding 1.7 million profiles, but their man was not there. The case into the murders was officially reopened in January 2000 under the name Operation Magnum. 27 years after the murders had taken place, they had a huge task ahead of them. They were only a team of 3, No murder case in the history of the UK had ever successfully been solved this long after the event. The old case files that were still available were looked into, but they had a budget for just 500 mouth swabs and a list of 35,000 names. So the first job was to narrow those suspects down from 35,000 to 500. The Port Talbot Steelworks alone, nearby to where Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd were found, had employed 13,000 men, and all were viewed as possible suspects. This advance in DNA also meant that they were able to rule out certain suspects as well really quickly. So for some, they believed that serial killer Fred West, who had lived near Neath at the time of the murders, may have been responsible, and he was now finally ruled out because they obviously did have his DNA available. It was while they're going through these files that they uncover a number of unsolved rapes, two of which bore a striking resemblance to the attack on Hughes and Floyd. The rapist, wearing a balaclava, would grab the victim from behind, punching and threatening them. He bound their hands with rope, raped them, and threatened to kill them. Was this the same man that would then go on to kill? Not only had the DNA and forensic investigation changed over the past 27 years, but so had policing. And by the time Operation Magnum got going, they were able to call in Rupert Heritage, former chief of the Behavioural Science Unit of Surrey Police, to draw up a 14-point psychological profile. The profile predicted that the killer would be white, late 20s to mid-30s, with a history of minor property crime, have come to the attention of the police as a juvenile at around 12 and likely to live in Neath or the surrounding area. He is also likely to have a history of assaults and possibly animal cruelty. He was unskilled and likely to have an incomplete family background, such as an absent father and a troubled marriage. He would collect weapons and have solo sports interests. So with this profile, the team were finally able, after 8 months, to whittle their 35,000 name list down to 500 names. But this was only half the battle. They now had to track down those people who, after 30 years, could be anywhere. That is, if they were still alive. Once a man was tracked down, they had the job of persuading him to give his DNA voluntarily, and though none of them refused, a lot of them were really not happy about the idea of being sort of implicated in a 30-year-old rape and murder case. And the police tracked people as far as New Zealand to get their DNA. But suspect 200 was bouncer Joseph William Cappan, originally placed on the list because he was a local man, known to the police, and he drove a white Austin 1100. However, he was someone who probably should have been looked at again, but because of the card indexing system, nobody joined the dots. When police knocked on his door in the Sandsfield estate in Port Talbot, his ex-wife answered the door. Cappan had been dead for 12 years, meaning that eventually, when all the live names had been swabbed, he would be on the list of those who needed a relative to submit DNA testing. Meanwhile, a DNA profile had also been pulled from Sandra Newton's clothing, and having met with her boyfriend for a quickie, this is harder to do because there's 3 sets of DNA, but when it finally came through, it matched the profile found on the clothing for Pauline Floyd. Not only did this finally confirm that the killer was the same man, but that he was local. Where Sandra's body had been found would only have been known to someone living in that area, so this again tightened the net. The police also realised that there was a chance that the killer had children that were on the national DNA database, and so they set to work. But unlike their colleagues with the index cards in the 1970s, this time computers were involved, and soon 22,000 names were reduced to 100, and one of those names belonged to Paul Cappan, who'd been arrested for stealing cars, and his father's name was on the original list. So they persuaded Cappan's ex-wife to submit her DNA so they could extract it from Paul's and then recreate as best they could the DNA of Joseph Kappen. And eventually they get a call from the forensics teams saying, I think you've got your man. But they'd only managed to build 3/4 of the DNA profile. So even though it was definitely Kappen, they needed to be sure. So on Christmas Eve 2001, Detective Chief Inspector Paul Bethel, the man in charge of Operation Magnum, who had been a 22-year-old constable when the crimes occurred, put in an application to the Home Secretary to have Joseph William Kappen exhumed. 5 months later, process began, and on a dark, stormy night in May 2002, the digging started. As they reached Kappen's coffin, a slash of lightning went through the sky, and one man said to another, I think he's reluctant to come up. Joseph William Kappen was born on the 30th of October 1941 and raised in Port Talbot in Neath, Port Talbot in South Wales. He was one of 7 siblings. His parents broke up when he was young, and he was brought up by his stepfather. Tick 1 on the profile, absent father. It seems that he suffered with what I call itchy fingers and was in trouble with the police from the age of 12. Tick 2 for the criminal profiler. He would then get arrested over 30 times for car theft, stealing petrol, burglary, theft and assault, and would be in and out of prison for a lot of his early life. When he wasn't in prison, he worked as a lorry driver and then as a bouncer, and was known as a loner, keeping himself to himself. In 1962, Kappen met his first wife, 17-year-old Christine Powell, who found the tall, dark, charming, blue-eyed man irresistible. In June of that year, 20-year-old Kappen and 2 juveniles were arrested and charged with stealing a car and then stealing petrol. And in February 1964, 10 days after they were married, Kappen went to prison for burglary. While he was there, Christine gave birth to their daughter, and while he was out of prison for the funeral of his grandfather, Kappen took Christine to an upstairs room, raped her, and she would go on to have their son Paul. So while he's in prison, she has 2 children. Throughout their marriage, Kappen was physically abusive to his wife, beating her whenever she crossed him and raping her every 2 weeks. He bred canaries and would have a number of rescue greyhounds over the years. But one day, while walking on the beach with his young son, he had one of the older greyhounds with him, and Kappen decided that the dog was too old. He found some wire and strangled the dog in front of his horrified child. Despite all of this, Kappen's family didn't believe he was capable of the rapes and murders of which he was accused. During his marriage, he would pursue teenage girls, often meeting them with his work as a bouncer, but there had never been reports of him being violent whilst in the act of sex. It would come to light after the discovery in 2001 that in 1964, Kappen attempted to force himself on a 15-year-old schoolgirl in his Sandfields housing estate. When they were walking past a half-finished house, he pushed her in and threw himself on top of her. Luckily, she screamed loudly and he jumped off her and ran away, but like many victims, she didn't want to report the incident to anyone, so they have no DNA proof. In March 1965, he was in trouble again, this time for stealing more than £7 from gas meters, which is about £108 in today's money, though add in the energy crisis, and that's probably about 1 day's worth of gas today. In October 1969, the Port Talbot Guardian reported a Port Talbot father of 2 had admitted to handling stolen clothes, which had been taken from clotheslines in various parts of town, was in court. It was 28-year-old Kappen, and he was fined £10 and given 2 years probation. In January 1970, he was arrested and pleaded guilty to having a faulty tyre on his car. In February 1973, a man resembling Kappen picked up 2 female hitchhikers and drove them to a nearby isolated road before attempting to rape both of them, but they managed to escape. The victims did not report the incident, as one of them was worried she'd get into trouble with her father. And again, this story comes forward after Kappen's name is released to the press in 2002. 3 months after the body was exhumed, the results come back. DNA taken from the teeth and femur confirmed that Joseph William Capon was the murderer of Sandra Newton, Geraldine Hughes, and Pauline Floyd. This made him the first person ever to be posthumously identified as a serial killer via familial DNA profiling, and the first documented serial killer in Welsh history. As with a lot of serial killers, Capon had been interviewed during the original investigation in October 1973 and, as had also happened in other cases, including the Yorkshire Ripper and Raymond Leslie Morris, was considered to have a watertight alibi because his wife vouched for him. He was constantly in trouble with the law, so when the police came over to interview him, Christine gave him an alibi. She was used to having to cover for him, and he was, apart from having sex with her without her consent, which she would later go on to say she thought that's what happened in marriage. She never thought the abuse that she suffered was unusual. She thought that's just how marriage was. She said, apart from the fact that it was non-consensual, it was not a violent act. But I understand that rape is in itself a violent act. But she just couldn't. She right up until the DNA confirmed it, until the results came back, she just didn't think he was capable of being a, quote, sex monster. Joseph William Capon died of lung cancer in 1990 at the age of 49, and though the police working on the case and the families of the victims could at least feel like the man was identified and the case closed, the fact that the man guilty of these terrible acts had never been taken in for questioning and made to pay for his crime left a bitter aftertaste. As Detective Chief Superintendent Wynne Phillips said, "While these results are conclusive, the suspect can never stand trial. And he can never confirm or deny his involvement in the murders and rapes and of other victims police believe he's linked to, like the murder of 23-year-old Maureen Mulcahy, who was strangled on a Saturday night in February 1976 and her body found in a wasteland near the Sandfields estate where Capon was living at the time. The reports held that she wasn't raped and there was no DNA from the crime kept, so we'll never know if Capon was involved. I'd say it's pretty likely, though. And that is the very distressing story of the Saturday Night Strangler. Thank you so much to Catherine for recommending it. I didn't know anything about it. His name rang a bell, but I hadn't looked into it at all. And just horrible how it dominated the victims' families' lives, and at least they had a name in the end. I really hesitate to use the word closure because it's not closure, and I suppose for them one can hope that lung cancer was an unpleasant way to go for him. Yeah, I just hope that at least having a name gives you somewhere to direct your anger, gives you a face to this evil person that has just completely ruined your life. Thank you to everyone who listens. You're amazing. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as one can. And I loved going to Wales in the 70s. It doesn't sound very dissimilar from a lot of the UK in the 2020s. Have a great week. For those who are on the Patreon, you'll get your mini-sode in a couple of days' time. You can email me at themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. You can find us on TikTok, Facebook and Instagram at The Monday Night Review and Patreon at The Monday Night Review. And until next time, be kind, stay safe and always check the back seat before you drive.